Welcome to this seminar, I Scream, Therefore I Exist, on the aesthetics of writing and resistance. I feel like it could have also been called I Write, Therefore I Exist. I'm going to start today by sharing a couple of images, and I'm going to put the names of the artists and the pieces in the chat, and then I'm just going to talk briefly about each of them. So Natalie, could you share the first image in the presentation, please? Great, thank you, Natalie. So this first image is called Temporary Storage, the Belongings of Juan Manuel Montes. And it's a piece by an LA-based visual artist. It's a sculpture, Camilo Ontiveros. And so essentially, in terms of the title points to what the piece is essentially about, the belongings of Juan Manuel Montes. Montes was the first dreamer to be deported by the Trump administration when DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was stopped under the Trump regime. And the artist, Camilo Ontiveros, who like Montes came to the US as an undocumented person, he contacted Montes's lawyers and also his mother, and he gained access, after Montes had been deported, he gained access to Montes's belongings. And so he essentially, as you can see in the image, in the sculpture, he tied Montes's belongings together and then put them on two sawhorses to create a sculpture and also an assemblage, I would call it as well. And you'll see in terms of the chat, so this piece is from 2017. Montes in 2009 did an earlier version of this piece where he used his own belongings that he had come with as an undocumented person. So there's two versions of this sculpture essentially. But it's interesting that, you know, the piece is really rooted in the artist's experience as well as an undocumented person. And Ontiveros really talks about that both the piece and his work is really about capturing the precarity of the undocumented person's predicament, and also a vertiginous sense, a sense of instability and precarity, and a sense of vertigo that comes when one comes to the US as an undocumented person and then is confronted with the arbitrary rulings that have been circulated or constructed around undocumented persons. And what's some good news in a sense is that, of course, just in the last week, DACA was started again. There was a federal court ruling. So now, even though it's still in play and fluxus, now suddenly dreamers, after I think it's been 3 years since the Trump regime stopped the DACA ruling, now it's in play again. So now there's some hope again for dreamers. So I'm going to move on then to the second image, please, Natalie. So then the second piece, Rumors of War 2019 by Kehinde Wiley, that you see on the screen. So in terms of this piece, you'll see in terms of, it was first installed in Times Square in New York, but Wiley really conceived of the sculpture as a direct response or intervention into the statues, the Confederate statues that line Monument Avenue in Richmond in Virginia. And he was really interested in trying to intervene and trying to displace both the image and the function of those Confederate statues. So as he describes it, he took and he drew inspiration from a particular statue of a Confederate Army General James Ewell Brown Stewart, which was created by Frederick Moynihan in 1907. And so Wiley worked with the posture, that kind of heroic pose of that Confederate statue. But then, of course, as we see in this, in terms of his revisioning of it, he took on the figure of a young African-American male, and as he put it, dressed in so-called urban streetwear. And he was really interested, his intent was very clear. He wanted it to commemorate the statue to be a commemoration to African-American youth who have been lost to the social and political battles that have been waged throughout our nation. And, you know, remember this piece was done in 2019, so it precedes this year, and the intense public interventions that have been taking place in terms of Confederate statues this year. So Wiley's work was very prescient in terms of predicting what was going to be happening this year in terms of those public rewritings and reinscribings of Confederate so-called monuments, especially following the death of George Floyd. And I'm just going to read briefly from Kehinde Wiley in terms of his statement about this statue, because this is why I wanted to show us these two pieces today. He says, art has always been about taking up space. That's one reason equestrian sculpture has been a thing. It's about dominance. We as a society stand behind the glorification of this human being on a pedestal for any number of reasons. That we now are allowed that volume of space, that massive amount of space to be allocated to a Black person in a hoodie might seem trivial, but this is a revolutionary act of embracing a Black presence in the public square. And it's actually quite shocking that these moments are still revolutionary in the 21st century. So those are Wiley's words in terms of his intent around this revisioning of what a monument, basically what a monument is. I'm often looking to visual art as a writer for inspiration. And I wanted to start off the seminar with these two pieces today, because I guess, you know, often in terms of writing, especially in terms of prose, we're thinking about time, yes? We talk a lot about narrative time and duration. A story takes place over time. But as I was thinking about this seminar today, I started thinking a lot about space, that as writers, the act of writing and the act of writing as resistance at times can be as simple as an act of taking up space, for the writer to be claiming space. And so that's something, I'm going to return to this motif and idea at the end of our time today, but I really want us to be thinking about that just on a very simple level, the notion of writing as taking up and claiming and occupying space, just as these two pieces are. And also just to be thinking as well, you know, on a broader level, that as writers, when we create books, they also take up space. Yes, they're physical objects. That physicality and materiality is something I've been thinking a lot about. So now we're going to get into looking at some text. So of course, those images are also text. So I'm going to take a sip of tea. And a breath. Okay. So Natalie, if we could go to excerpt number 1, please. And as always, I have more material that than in the handout than we're going to get through today. We'll only get to look at a fraction of it, and hopefully you can think of it as a bit of a goodie bag that you can take this material home with you if this is a topic that interests you. But so we're going to look at, and we're going to start off with some theory to frame the texts that are in the rest of the handout. So this comes from a conversation between Gary Olson and Jean-Francois Lyotard. So Jean-Francois Lyotard, if you're not familiar with him, the book that perhaps is, well, he's known for a number of works, but one of the books he's most well known for is The Postmodern Condition, which was a really major text in terms of studies around postmodernity. And I'm going to read this quote and I'm going to extract a couple of things about it for us to think about as we proceed. But I'd really like you to also, in terms of the chat, if you see anything in this that especially sparks you in terms of relating to your own process as a writer, especially if you feel like you're someone who's working in that intersection of writing and social resistance. So, please put, your comments and observations in the chat if anything sparks you from this quote. So Olson asks Lyotard, in a postmodern world, how should we view the role of writing? And so then this is Lyotard's answer, and as you can see, I've condensed it a fair amount. Writing is the capacity to resist the network of exchanges in which cultural objects are commodities. And maybe to write is precisely to avoid making a book a commodity. That's to say, to write is necessarily to allude to something else which is not easily communicated. It doesn't mean that a work is difficult to read. It could be very simple, but it alludes to something else. A writer is somebody confronted with the unknown. That's to say, they are really confronted with language itself. There is a sort of fight, a battle with and against words. To write is to advance or want something that is not clear, and to discover a means of giving testimony of that which is precisely not yet included in the circulation of commodities. It is not yet known. To write is to resist the already done, the already written, the already thought. So there's perhaps if you this is material, I began teaching a version of this class to undergrads many years ago. And so I think this was probably one of, I've been using this material, this particular quote for a long time. Perhaps if you're new to it, there might be a density to it. But I want to extract a couple of things from it that for me, I feel like are really clear, because I feel all the writers that are in this handout are in distinct ways enacting what Lyotard is describing here. They are all using writing as a space to resist commodification, in particular commodification of their own identities, but in very distinct ways. Also, they're all using writing as a space to resist that which has already been inscribed. They're really pushing that. They're really pushing a language to that extreme, resisting ideas that have already been circulated, that have already been written, or that have already been thought. And they're also really engaged with as Lyotard says, a kind of battle with language itself in that regards. I think there's a couple of kind of interesting tensions and contradictions in this that I want to point out as we think about writing as social resistance. One is this notion, well, and also writing in general, first of all. At the start, Lyotard says, to write is to resist the network of exchanges in which cultural objects are commodities. To recite is precisely to avoid making a book a commodity. And, I think there's a central contradiction there, yes, in terms of as writers, obviously on a practical level, a pragmatic level, we are all interested, regardless of the kind of writing we're doing, we want our books to become, in a literal sense, commodities. We want them to be published. We want readers to buy them. We want our words to be circulated. But what Lyotard, I think, is stressing here is this idea that we want to avoid bringing in ideas or themes in our work that are commodities, that are ideas that can somehow be bought and sold. Lyotard's book, The Postmodern Condition, his main critique was this idea that in the 20th century, knowledge had become a kind of commodity that was, rather than treating it as an end in itself, we were interested in ideas that could be repackaged and redistributed and circulated, like just any kind of commodity, that can be bought or sold, any kind of consumer product. So there's that interesting tension there that Lyotard is saying, actually, as writers, we should be really pushing to bring in ideas that can't easily then be reincorporated as market products, as market commodities. I think, though, in a sense, in a more specific sense, in terms of writing and social resistance, I think an interesting contradiction or tension in this quote is that if we think about political discourse and social discourse, for political ideas to gain traction, often it requires a certain repetition, yes? Think about, political slogans, Black Lives Matter. Think about during the worst part of the AIDS epidemic and ACT UP, silence equals death. Political discourse functions by repetition and reinscription on a very practical level. Whereas Lyotard here is advocating writing should be working to something that is not easily communicated, and that it should resist that which has already been written or already thought, that as writers, we should always be pushing to bring in new ideas, to say things that haven't yet been said, that ideas that aren't already out there in public discourse. So again, there's, I think, this interesting tension or contradiction that I really want to sort of state up front. And Jacques Derrida, I'll type his name in the chat for people here. Jacques Derrida, the French deconstructionist philosophy, one of my favorite quotes of his is, "Coherence and contradiction expresses the force of a desire." And so I want to let those tensions and contradictions that I'm extracting from this quote from Lyotard, really bring those into the room or all the rooms we're in today. And as we proceed, but again, be thinking about how the writers we're about to look at are in the very distinct ways enacting what Lyotard is doing, but also be thinking about your own process. That's the one thing I want you to be leaving with by the end of this session, is that in what ways are you as writers really working in an area where you're trying to resist things that have already been done or written or thought, and you're trying to bring in new ideas, to circulate new ideas that can't be easily turned into sort of neat little commodities, and be thinking that that's such an important task for us as writers. So, Natalie, why don't we proceed to quote number 2, please? We'll start looking at a text. Okay. So this first example that we're going to look at today is from the novel The Bondwoman's Narrative by Hannah Crafts. It's and it says down here, of course, it was edited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. So this is a text that is seen as one of the earliest books written by a fugitive slave, a woman who was a fugitive slave. Her pen name was Hannah Crafts. Her actual name was Hannah Bond. Henry Louis Gates Jr. acquired it at an auction. And so then it wasn't published, of course it was published posthumously. It wasn't published until 2002. And there was, a fair amount of research went in terms of reconstructing, actually since its publication, who Hannah Crafts actually was. Afterwards, if you're interested, you can go online and you can, you can actually see the text itself written in her own hand, which is a really beautiful thing to see. You can see the lines she crosses out and her kind of word choices. We'll see a little bit of some of that today. So I'm going to read this excerpt, and I'm going to put in a question for people that I want you to be thinking about as I read. I'll type that into the chat. But I just want you to be thinking about, on a fairly straightforward level, how is resistance being enacted here on the page by the author or the character or the narrator or the persona? So let me type this in. So again, as I read, it was kind of hard to excerpt, but it's again, how is resistance being enacted on the page here by the author or the character or the narrator or the persona? And just to give a brief, this passage occurs early on in the novel. The first part is in Virginia. The narrator, Hannah, is a house slave. And at first she's on the plantation Lindendale. Her master is about to get married, and she's been assigned the task to, before he comes back with his wife, to clean a certain portion of the house. And just the one other thing I would say is that, so she's in a space, we'll see she's looking at a number of portraits of all the previous owners of the house. And there's a concept essentially in the narrative that all the previous owners of the house have always had their portrait next to the portrait of their wives. But in this instance, right now, the current master of the plantation, his portrait is by itself because he hasn't yet brought his wife back. So I think that sort of sets the context of the plot. But again, as I'm reading this, be thinking about, and put your observations into the chat if you want, be thinking about just how is resistance happening on this page in terms of what the author is doing or what the character is doing. Memories of the dead give at any time a haunting air to a silent room. How much more this becomes the case when standing face to face with their pictured resemblances and looking into the stony eyes motionless and void of expression as those of an exhumed corpse. But even as I gazed, the golden light of sunset penetrating through the open windows in an oblique direction set each rigid feature in a glow. Movements like those of life came over the line of stolid faces as the shadows of a linden played there. The stern old sire with sword and armorial bearing seems moodily to relax his haughty brow. Oh, and actually I'm seeing in the PowerPoint the crossouts aren't showing up, but you'll see that it says haughty brow aspect. One of those lines should be crossed out, but it's not showing up in the text. I'm just going to read from my notes just so I see those. Where was I? The countenance of another, a veteran in the old-time wars, assumes a gracious expression it never wore in life. And another appears to open and shut his lips continually, though they emit no sound. Over the pale, pure features of a bride descends a halo of glory. The long, shining locks of a young mother waver and float over the child she holds, and the frozen cheek of an ancient dame seems beguiled into smiles and dimples. Involuntarily, I gazed as the fire of the sun died out, even until the floor became dusky and the shadows of the linden falling broader and deeper wrapped all in gloom. Hitherto I had not contemplated my master's picture, for my thoughts had been with the dead, but now I looked for it, where it hung solitary, and thought how soon it would have a companion like the others, and what a new aspect would thereby be given to the apartment. But was it prophecy or presentment, or why was it that this idea was attended to my mind with something painful? That it seemed the first scene in some fearful tragedy, the foreboding of some great calamity, a curse of destiny that no circumstances could avert or soften. And why was it that as I mused, the portrait of my master seemed to change from its usually kind and placid expression to one of wrath and gloom, that the calm brow should become wrinkled with passion, the lips turgid with malevolence? Yet thus it was. Though filled with superstitious awe, I was in no haste to leave the room. For there, surrounded by mysterious associations, I seemed suddenly to have grown old, to have entered a new world of thoughts and feelings and sentiments. I was not a slave with these pictured memorials of the past. They could not enforce drudgery or condemn me on account of my color to a life of servitude. As their companion, I could think and speculate. In their presence, my mind seemed to run riotous and exult in its freedom as a rational being, and one destined for something higher and better than this world can afford. I closed the windows, for the night air had become sharp and piercing, and the linden creaked and swayed its branches to the fitful gusts. Then there was a sharp voice at the door. It said, "Child, what are you doing?" I turned round and answered, looking at the pictures. Mrs. Bry, and she's the housekeeper, Mrs. Bry, alarmed at my prolonged absence, had actually dragged her unwieldy person hither to ascertain the cause. Looking at the pictures, she repeated, as if such an ignorant thing as you are would know anything about them. Ignorance, forsooth. Can ignorance quench the immortal mind or prevent its feeling at times the indications of its heavenly origin? Can it destroy that deep, abiding appreciation of the beautiful that seems inherent to the human soul? Can it seal up the fountains of truth and all intuitive perception of life, death, and eternity? I think not. Those to whom man teaches little, nature, like a wise and prudent mother, teaches most. So it's such, I really feel like I wanted to start the seminar looking at excerpts today with this text. It feels like we're going back to the roots of writing as resistance in such a fundamental way, and just in terms of thinking of the historical context in which all of our writing is taking place. It's incredibly, I highly recommend this novel. It's incredibly beautiful. I'll make a couple of comments and I see like people are, see if anything's up in the chat. There's a few things I think that are really important to extract from this. One, and first off, is the interesting relationship between the author and the character in this text, yes. It's almost a work of, there's sometimes some of you may have heard of me talk about the, the genre of autofiction, where there's sort of a blurring between fiction and non-fiction. That line is blurred. And this is an autobiographical novel, but it almost feels like an early example of autofiction. We have the character is Hannah. The writer is, her pen name is Hannah Crafts. And I love that the last, her last name, the pen name is Crafts, in terms of how we think about craft. And then her actual name was Hannah Bond. So there's a very intimate connection, yes, between the author and the narrator and the protagonist. And what I think is fascinating is that we see Hannah, the character. She's looking at those pictures, yes? She's looking at the picture of her master. She's looking at a representation. And she's in that space where suddenly she goes into her inner world. And, she says in that, I think, the key passage is the one that begins, though filled with superstitious awe. She suddenly has access to her inner life and her inner imaginings, the world of speculation. And, she says, suddenly I'm not a slave with these pictured memorials of the past. They cannot enforce drudgery or condemn me on account of my color to a life of servitude. As their companion, I can think and I can speculate. In their presence, my mind seemed to run riotous and exult in its freedom as a rational being, one destined for something higher and better than this world can afford. So suddenly, she goes into her inner life, a space that no one can control, Mrs. Bry can't control, despite Mrs. Bry's projection onto her in terms of, oh, as a slave, as a Black woman, you can't have any kind of knowledge around these pictures. But suddenly Hannah goes into her inner life and no one can control her there. You know, she's interpreting these pictures as she wishes to. And then we have Hannah Crafts, the writer, in a sense, essentially doing the same thing, yes, through the act of writing. She's interpreting, you know, she's writing this incredibly autobiographical account of her life. And she was a fugitive slave. She fled, you know, she was in Virginia and then North Carolina as a slave, Hannah Bond, the woman, and then she fled for the East. And to return to that notion of thinking about writing as inscribing space, I'm just very interested in that, you know, thinking about also at the time, this text was written in the 1850s, you know, between 1850s up to 1861, pre-emancipation. Think about the edicts or the prohibitions and the laws around forbidding slaves to read and or write. So think of just on a fundamental level for Hannah Crafts to write this text, to inscribe space, to inscribe the page in her, and, you know, just again, check out her handwriting at some point, it's exquisite. On that fundamental level, that action of inscribing one's voice on the page, just on that simplest level, is an act of resistance. At that time, in its historical context, an incredible act of resistance. But I want us to keep thinking of how that, on that fundamental level today, that writing, that simple act of inscribing one's voice on the page can continue to be an act of resistance, of claiming space on the page, of occupying space. And also to be thinking about how, you know, if we're thinking about, you know, writing's an interesting thing, yes, because clearly, you know, this text was written in private. It's written in Hannah Crafts was inscribing her voice on the page. It's a private act. This text didn't get published until long after her death, you know, not until the 21st century. But of course, writing, ultimately, we want it to be a public act. So that private act of her inscribing her voice onto the page, of claiming space, I'm interested in thinking about it, of how it's analogous to the physicality of public protest, of inserting one's body into public space and putting one's body in the public sphere, you know, at a Black Lives Matter protest, for example. So there's that kind of interesting way of how just inscribing one's voice on the page in the privacy of the page is analogous to inserting one's body into the public sphere as an act of protest, into public space as an act of resistance. I'm going to add one or two more things, but I just want to see what people are saying in the chat. People are quoting lines from it. The language is amazing. Yes, Sarah, in terms of pointing out to the genre, I think that's a really important, you know, the Gothic aspect of the genre. There's an incredible Gothic atmosphere to this novel, and I think I would highly recommend it on that level in terms of a 19th century Gothic novel. In terms of genre, I think the writer is really doing interesting things in terms of, I don't think, appropriating, it's interesting. We often think of appropriating now, it has negative connotations, but we can think of this as a kind of radical act of appropriation in terms of Hannah Crafts appropriating the European Gothic genre and then applying it to her own autobiographical narrative and kind of reinscribing it. A lot has been written about this novel, that she also, Hannah Bond, the woman, seems to have access to the library on the plantation that she was on in North Carolina. And so there's aspects of the novel where she draws on Dickens' Bleak House. She also draws on Jane Eyre. And she really really draws in numerous texts from the canon. So I think in terms of genre, this is a really interesting act of resistance where she's not only going against the social prohibitions and legal prohibitions around a Black woman writing at that moment, but she's really playing with genre and basically claiming genre for her own, claiming the canon for her own in a really interesting way. And again, in terms of thinking of the reverberations of this in the 21st century, especially for those of you as writers who are working in different genres that you feel like might have been denied you, or that you might feel have somehow your voice hasn't been allowed in, I think that can also continue to be a really interesting act of resistance for you as writers today, to be working with genres that previously you might have been left out of, that your voice hasn't been included in. I'm just going to go down to the chat again. Kelly Howard says, the powerful tension between what the protagonist is thinking and the housekeeper's observation. In terms of the Gothic tone vibe, it evokes for me one of my favorite books, Jane Eyre. Absolutely, the way Jane speaks to the reader. Yes, and I think that's a great point in terms of the narrative tension between what Hannah is thinking, her inner life, and then that absolute unconscious dehumanization, of course, that Mrs. Bride projects onto her, which I think is also something we're going to be keep seeing in a number of the texts that are in this handout. The way that writing as an act of resistance is often a way to simply claim one's humanity when one's humanity has been denied by a power structure, to really just that, I mean, on a fundamental level, to say, actually, no, I have this inner life and I'm choosing to inscribe it. Alison, there's a suspension of existence or reality, and a powerful internal existence or reality replaces it. Yeah, absolutely. There's this interesting kind of conflict or tension between one reality, a kind of the white supremacist reality that Hannah, the character, finds herself in, is being shifted to the own reality that she's replacing it with, this reality of inner life. Yes, Sarah, and absolutely, that Gates bought the manuscript at an auction, and I think for I think it was for about $8,000, like a shockingly low amount. But Franz Fanta, can you speak to urban planning being oppressive in terms of you saying inserting one's body into the public sphere as an act of resistance? I mean, that might take me on a direction that might get me too far digressing. Let me think about it for a moment. I mean, I think just let me think on that. I want to kind of keep going forward just as I see the clock is ticking, but I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, but also I think just generally thinking about social space as a space that, and perhaps in terms of what you're getting at, Franz, that social space is always designed to let some bodies be more safe, yes, and more comfortable, and others to always feel at risk and at danger. So I think in some ways, I mean, I'd need to keep thinking about that, but of course, so many implications come up around this topic. Sarah Haas says, I'm thinking about the contrast between claiming space on a page, literally making an impression with a pen on a page as a private act, later to become a public one, versus claiming space in a more land-based and so colonialist sense, making a space private. Right, like the privatization of space. Fascinating. Oh gosh, there's lots of comments. Philip says, it's interesting that she asserts that her inner life thoughts cannot be controlled by bondage, either by white supremacy, slavery, or a past freedom that Africans from the continent may have known. She seems to condemn the notion of ignorance being a lack of formal education. She resists dehumanization by claiming humanity and emotional intelligence. Absolutely. She kind of turns on its head and displaces the whole notion that a formal education grants someone a kind of mastery. And she's really claiming that power of that intuitive, embodied knowledge that comes from within, that no one can deny her. And of course, it's something that's so important, but to be thinking about the body in terms of writing and resistance, but to be thinking about the body and the way that subjugation, in terms of on the most brutal and fundamental level in terms of slavery, but that subjugation always takes place around the body and control over the body, over the freedom and autonomy of one's body. And so Hannah, as the character, is then claiming this space that is somehow outside of that subjugation in terms of the inner life. And then Arson says, the prose makes me experience Mrs. Bry's comments as absurd. The absurdity of denying an enslaved person's interiority. Yeah, interesting. Brings up the way historical assumptions, when recontextualized and reframed, kind of seem absolutely ridiculous, of course, but of course, had huge, power. And then Deborah says, the portraits and their permanence in contrast with slaves whose lives are not given the universal permanence associated with portraits. By writing, Bond can make a statement that her life matters and that she exists. Absolutely. There's those portraits of all the white masters there on the wall, the representations. But Hannah as the character, but then Hannah Bond Craft as the writer is saying, well, of course, my portrait's never going to appear up there, my representation. Instead, I'm going to craft my own representation in terms of this book. And it reminds me just of, in terms of Hannah Bond Craft's not knowing whether her book would ever get published. But then Helene Cixous always talks about the, writing. There's such a poignancy to writing that comes out after someone's death, and that writing for all of us, we should think about it as putting a little note. Those notes you'd put in a little bottle, like in a ship, inside a bottle, and then throw it into the ocean, and then who knows? We're always so obsessed with getting published, but to be thinking about the futurity of it. So I'm going to move, just so at least we can look at one more example. Thank you for those comments and engaging with the text. I'm going to make sure we look at least one more example and then a little bit more theory. So Natalie, can we jump to, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Can we jump ahead to quote number 6? So this, we're going to move to a poem from, I'm just going to check that. Oh, great, thank you. So here's a poem from, we're going to jump ahead from the 19th century to 2021 or 2019. It's a poem by the great Black queer poet Dawn Lundy Martin, and it's called Nothingness. And I'm just going to read it, but again, I want to extract a little bit from it, but as I'm reading, be thinking about how is this poet enacting resistance on the page, and in particular on the space of this poem. Just what she's doing to create a space of resistance through this poem. And I think also what themes are emerging in terms of resistance and the possibilities of giving voice to resistance. So nothingness. I don't want to say anything. What is it to be saying? Forced speech, rape speech. I have no subjectivity or light subjectivity. Speaking defunct. Landmass floats, and the forests have been felled, and the antlers snapped. Morphed lips already sown. Most of us are keen to mouth the word beast. Everyone is talking like dentures, clack, clack, but nothing is really said, or so much chatter static. I am not saying anything either, am waiting and breathing. My body is speaking, expressing the thingness of the thing. It chats at me, motoring. In the taxi, a tree-shaped purple fragrance floats across face. To be a red scratch or red scotch, depending on your liking, calculation of the sublime or the sublime itself, memory fixed and then splatter. My mother in her pink kitchen washes what the garden and its grey chemicals produced. Outside, the gate ajar, the dog run wilding, a thing called girl splay or wheat heart. We could draw a chalk line there. This is not conceptual. This is a poem. You are a poem. I am. The hesitancy, the undoingness, more secrets, humiliation as release. The men all say, I want to stretch you out, feel themselves big in this small corner of the world. How chivalrous, the ache of any obvious sliding down. What would the poem be without wings to block out the light? So let me tune into the chat yet. So while I'm seeing if anyone has responses around this particular poem, I guess I want to extract a couple of things in terms of, clearly we're moving from prose to poetry. I feel like there's some interesting things happening in terms of the space of the struggle with language and the struggle that the persona of the poet is having, is engaging with in this text. If we think about, I get the sense that in the first text we looked at, there's this, and not to reduce it, but there's this desire embedded in terms of the protagonist, this desire to speak, to articulate, and to have one's ideas be heard. In this poem from by Lundy Martin, we get this problematization of what it is to speak, yes, and of how to speak. And I think in terms of Lyotard's quote, in terms of writing as resistance and how we might think about writing as resistance, we really see this battle that the poet is engaging with in terms of language and really figuring out what does it, how to give voice to resistance? What does it mean to speak? As she kind of writes at the start of the poem, I don't want to say anything. And this notion of what is it to be saying? What is it to be speaking resistance? How to speak? Lundy Martin, in terms of her own comments of this poem, I think are worth pulling out. She says, this poem comes out of despair. Its first concern is the problem of discourse in this age of fascism, global populism, global warming, mass migration, and the persistent assault on female and femme bodies. When I say discourse, I mean the network of meaning that comes from all utterances and the way they overlap. If nothing is produced in this supposed meaning making, nothing that elevates our humanness, what is left for us to do? And for me, that really contextualizes and grounds this poem, and seeing that she's writing it out of this space of struggle. She refers to the problem of discourse in terms of multiple competing discourses and multiple competing problems in terms of fascism, global warming, assault on specifically gendered bodies. And this struggle as a poet to find one's speaking space amidst, as she says, the network of meaning that comes from all utterances and the way they overlap. So we really see, as Lyotard says, that struggle to speak. I think we see, as Lyotard says, this notion of writing as resistance, as an advancement of something which is not easily communicated and that is not clear. And we see that, Lyotard always says that writing should be a voyage into the unknown. And I think we really see the poet enacting that voyage and that struggle to figure out how to speak and how to speak clearly, excuse me, within the despair that the poet is feeling. There's that kind of engagement with words, but then, and I think we also very clearly see this this resistance to that which has already been written or already thought or already articulated, both by the poet, but also generally out there. So I think there's this really complex and visceral struggle that the poet's engaging with in this poem to figure out, okay, how as writers in 2020, amidst the constant horrors we're confronted with, and both the material problems, physical violence, linguistic violence, how to speak. I'm going to go to the comments for a moment. So Tracy Young talks about the resistance to poetry and language itself. Indu points out the middle stanzas long, like being stretched out. And Tracy talks about the embrace of it ultimately. Yeah, I think we see there's amidst the fragmentation of this poem, I think there's a sort of a jubilance to it as well. There's in terms of it as an investigation. And also, it arrives within the shifts in terms of the stanzas, like within that early sort of space where it is, I don't want to say anything. What is it to be saying? I have no subjectivity or light subjectivity. Everyone is talking like dentures, clack, clack, but nothing is really said. I am not saying anything either. I'm waiting and breathing. But then within that, the poet then begins to arrive, I think through interestingly enough, and even though obviously this is a radically different text formally from the one we just looked at, interestingly enough, then that next line in the first stanza, my body is speaking, expressing the thingness of the thing. Within the confusions of discourse and language, it seems like the poet grounds herself within the body, just as Hannah in the previous text grounds herself in her inner life and her intuitive knowledge. So suddenly the poet's body is speaking. Then she kind of goes through the next stanzas, shifting between a number of conflicting images and a tension of images, but then to get to that, this is not conceptual. This is a poem. You are a poem. I am. So within that struggle to articulate oneself, she gets to this space of, again, the simple act of inscribing the page and asserting one's voice on the page. I am, just these two words. So it's interesting that within the conflicting investigation of the poem, she arrives at quite a simple assertion of how to inscribe one's voice on the page. Megan says, yeah, can't stop rereading the poem. It's really I feel like for me, it's a fascinating poem in that I need to keep going back to it to keep understanding with it. And it always eludes my understanding. Michael talks about the horizontal and vertical orientation in form. Yeah, it feels like the poem formally is very non-hierarchical in terms of the way it treats images. Sarah Valentine, I love that. It's like you're telepathic today in terms of things you're mentioning. You mentioned Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? I love that you bring that up, because absolutely one thing in this poem, and I think again to think theoretically about how to give voice to resistance. Lyotard mentions early on in that quote, he says that, sometimes even if writing is resistance, even if we're trying to communicate something that's not easily communicated, it can still be quite simple. But there's also the notion that Lyotard, I think, brings up that at times writing is resistance. If we're trying to give voice to resistance, at times it's going to result in a more complicated form, like Lundi Martin's poem. And in terms of that essay you mentioned from, and Sarah put her name in the chat, but Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, the post-colonial theorist, and her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Spivak is a really interesting theorist, and that, in terms of post-colonial theory, she talks about that one of the things that the colonizer or the imperialist often thought of was that they could see through the body of the colonized subject. So for example, in the first text we looked at, Mrs. Bry she thinks, you know, she says to Hannah, oh, what would you know about paintings, you ignorant being? She thinks she can understand and see through Hannah's body. She thinks she's transparent. And Hannah, of course, says, you know, knows that inside her there's this whole world that Mrs. Bry has no access to. Spivak talks about the notion of opacity. I'll just type it in here. But that a strategy of resistance that can be employed by a writer is the strategy of opacity, this strategy that, oh, you think you can understand me, you think you can see through me, let me write in a language that you won't be able to see through, you won't be able, let me deny your interpretation. And I think in some ways Dawn Lundy Martin is kind of in some ways working within that strategy of working within a language that displaces colonial and post-colonial impositions upon to the colonized body, the colonized subject. So yeah, thank you. I wasn't sure if I was going to get to Spivak today, Sarah, but thank you for just, I think it's a really important theoretical frame generally for us to think about this subject. And also in terms of the essay that Sarah points to, Can the Subaltern Speak? I saw, just as a side note, I saw Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak speak once when she was when I was still living in Australia as an undergrad, and it was probably the most thrilling kind of seminar I ever went to. She's an incredible speaker, and also very she speaks very much at times, you know, she's incredibly rigorous, but then she'll go on these interesting digressions in the present moment that are of interest to me. But anyway, to get back to my point, Spivak's essay, a really important point she brings up theoretically is this idea that on a most fundamental level, we should never speak for the subaltern. We should never speak for the person who has been denied a speaking space. What we need to do is to clear a space and create a place from which the subaltern can speak. And, you know, just in terms of what I talked about earlier, in terms of thinking about looking at those, you know, the two sculptures and thinking about writing as an act of inscribing space, inscribing one's voice onto the page. It's a really important thing in terms of the general framework of writing as a resistance, that we keep identifying places and spaces. Well, we keep identifying people who currently don't have a voice within public power structures and clearing spaces from which they can write and from which they can, you know, articulate their viewpoint. I mean, to me, that's the function of pedagogy, just on a most fundamental level. Let me see. There's some smiley faces. There's some more thanks. Arson says, yes, absolutely, relates to Orientalist material too. What is the power to define or present the dominant gaze? Yeah, absolutely. Like Edward Said, yeah, Sarah, absolutely. The notion of that sort of the exoticizing, the objectifying of the non-Western body. And there's a text we probably, well, we'll see if there's a text in here that we may not get to today, but on that, there's a really amazing text by an Iranian writer, Behruz Buchani, that is in the handout that if we don't get to today, I really, if this is a topic that interests you, I really want you to look at it in your own time, because it's just in terms of that whole concept of the subaltern, of people who have literally been denied a voice on a most brutal level. Behruz Buchani's work is incredibly important. So I'm going to, Natalie, if we could go to, I think it's quote number 7. Yes. So I'm going to bring in a little bit more theory again, because I think this is a really important, just kind of theoretical perspective that frames both the two texts we've seen, but also one way I want you to be thinking about writing in resistance generally, both in terms of other writers, but especially in terms of your own work, because that's really important, because I know a lot of you are engaging with this discursive space. So this comes from Elizam Escobar, who's an amazing, he's a visual artist, he's a theorist, he's a poet from Puerto Rico. He was imprisoned for seditious activities, as in terms of, he was kind of very actively engaged in terms of the struggle for Puerto Rican independence. But he was granted clemency by President Clinton, when he was president. But he wrote these incredible essays from prison, and a couple of other of the texts in the handout that we may or may not get, we probably won't get to today, you know, written from prison. But he wrote these incredibly, for me, informative essays on how to think about what it means to give voice to resistance and the complexities of it. So I'm going to move around with some excerpts from it. And I guess I want you to be thinking about, as I read this, perhaps just how, for those of you who are engaged with writing and social resistance on some level, you know, we can define that in many ways, yes. But think about how what Escobar is positing, how it perhaps relates to some of your own struggles as writers, some of the problems you're confronted with as writers when you're dealing with this space of, you know, in a way, in a sense that Lundy Martin really, I think her poem, you know, she's confronting just the fundamental problem of how to speak, how to give voice to what I'm feeling amidst this discursive overload and amidst the horrors of the 21st century, the political horrors. So Escobar writes, "What is important is not the didactic pretensions that we possess the solutions, but the idiosyncratic ways in which works of art can bring out the real aspects of the human condition in particular and specific contexts or experiences. Most US political art, as I have come to understand it, wants to present political direct issues through images in a clear and communicative form, irrespective of the medium, the style, or the aesthetic selection. It presupposes that one can predict the kind of political effect a work of art is going to have. Thus, the important thing is the message. In this way, the participants are excluded from creating meanings other than those already transmitted by the message, since once the signal is sent, either you accept it or reject it. There is no need to search for more. But how one is going to affect others is another matter, since it is almost impossible to know how an artwork will be taken. The effect is always diverse, contingent, and unpredictable. Whether this ambivalence is richer than a clear-cut message is for others to decide. The political aspect of art, thus, is to confront all of reality without ideological permissions and through its own means. One must always make the distinction between the art of propaganda, publicity, or design, and art as an act of liberation. The fundamental distinction is that an art of liberation can neither be a model nor a specific aesthetic or style. It is a concept and an attitude with no specific formulations, only that it must be open to any strategy that can help liberate art and through art people from the dictatorship of the logic, politics, and metaphysics of the sign." So I'm going to say a couple of things about this, and just if you have any thoughts about the ideas he's positing in relation to your own work or in relation to the work of others, and just generally in relation to this topic of how to give voice to resistance, please put them in. Just to frame where he's coming from, I guess his theoretical background, he was engaged a lot with, he comes from a background of, you know, where a lot of his politics and his theory was grounded in Marxist praxis. But as an artist, he writes a lot about how at a certain point he often found himself, he felt like he was being criticized from all sides in terms of the art he was producing, because he felt burdened in the late, this is the late part of the 20th, well, both in the later portion of the 20th century in terms of his engagement as an artist. He often felt like his art was being, both from all political angles, was being configured as not correct art, not giving a clear political message, presenting clear political themes. And he felt kind of very burdened by that, which I think is where that last paragraph is such a really interesting dichotomy he presents. And I think like all dichotomies, or binaries, we shouldn't think of it as fixed, it could be a blur, but this notion that there's art of propaganda and then there's art as act of liberation. And, I mentioned in my seminar description that one thing I really want us to leave here today is thinking about that. Above all, we should be thinking about that there's a multiplicity of ways in which we can give voice to resistance as writers and artists. And this is really what Elizam is positing, the distinction that an art of liberation, there can be no model, no specific aesthetic or style. There's no specific formulations, only that it must be open to any strategy that can help liberate art and people from the dictatorship of logic, politics, and metaphysics of the sign. Here he's also drawing upon, while he was writing these essays, he was reading a lot of postmodern theory, post-structuralist theory, like Lyotard, and Alison, I'll look at your comment in a moment, actually. But here, he's very much referring to the earlier portion of this quote, where he's saying that for him as an artist, he thinks it's really important that as artists, we're not, to remember that we're not advertisers. We shouldn't be thinking that we have a message or theme that we want to sell to the reader/consumer. He's positive, and I see, as Arsen points out, this notion, it absolutely relates to Lyotard's notion of resisting commodification. That as writers, we should think of our poems, our stories, our books, not as commodities that can be easily fixed into some kind of clear-cut notion or idea that can be easily sort of, basically that goes down too easily in terms of that functions as a consumer product. What I think is brilliant about Escobar's theorizing is that he's also bringing out this notion that, often, and he's referring to a lot of US political art, that we often think that it has to have, it's in the early portion of the quote, there has to be a clear message, it has to be clearly communicated, and that as artists, we can predict the kind of effect our work is going to have. But he says, that's actually really an oppressive and limited way to treat art, because participants are excluded from giving multiple interpretations. We're saying, as he says, you either accept the message from my signal or you reject it. So it's like you either buy, the reader either buys your product or they don't buy it. But, as he says in the middle of the quote, we can't predict how readers are going to interpret our work. So to really get out of that dichotomy to really break the chain, he's drawing on his semiotics training, this notion that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is clear-cut. He says, we actually have to break that chain and really just allow for a multiplicity of ways to give voice to resistance and a multiplicity of ways in which the work can be interpreted and understood, to break out away from that notion of the text as a commodified product. And he's really sort of drawing on, there's another excerpt in the handout that we won't look at today, but he's really, I think, also drawing on a really marvelous text from Leon Trotsky and Andre Breton, written in the earlier part of the 20th century, drawing on this notion, kind of almost like of an anarchistic notion of an art of liberation that doesn't answer to anyone from above, that always and allows for multiple forms and formations. Just going to look at what people have been typing in. Arsen points to the connection between Lyotard and Elizam's ideas, that political art that is strictly about its content, political stories can be distilled in a Wikipedia summary. But if we include the affective dimension, the experience of a work, then we get a more rigorous sense of political art. Well said. Tracy says, in my own writing, I continually struggle between didacticism, claiming strong POV, and ambiguity, ambivalence. Yeah, and I think, Tracy, you just articulate that beautifully and really incredibly clearly. That's really, I think, often the heart of the struggle. I think it connects very much to, that tension I was pointing out in terms of Lyotard's quote that we began with, this sense that, I think at times it's crucial, strategically at times it's crucial for a theme and a message to come across very clearly. But then there's that struggle, you say, between didacticism and ambiguity and ambivalence. And what I think the hope that Escobar's theorizing gives me is that, remember, we can have both, I think. We can both have a really strong POV, as you put it, but also allow for ambiguity and ambivalence. Those two things can shift, can operate equally within a text, I think. So to not think that that's a binary, that we have to do one or the other, but that we can really kind of move between both. A strong POV can also contain a huge amount of ambivalence. Nancy says, this gives me such a clear articulation of my artistic goals, art of liberation. I think often of how I write for myself, but I endeavor to publish and share in the service of transmuting the social order in whatever small way. This is helping me formulate the question, how can the work I produce be an act of liberation? Well said. Sarah Allwright points to the Marshall McLuhan essay, The Medium is the Message. Yeah, absolutely. That's another text that Elizam is kind of really obviously relating to. And she also says, I think of the democratization of publication by forums like Medium and self-publishing versus traditional presses. The message being whose voices should be heard and who should not. Yeah, this absolutely brings up the whole, in terms of commodification, brings up this whole other area of research that I hadn't even, that, I think would be, warrants further investigation in terms of the whole hierarchy of publishing and the way self-publishing is seen as, clearly, literature, the one thing I think we can say sure about it is that the literary apparatus is hierarchical in terms of the publishing world is hierarchical. And so self-publishing versus, who you publish with, there's a value system. So I think this brings up some interesting questions about the marketplace of publishing, which is, maybe one of you might do a future seminar on that. I'm going to, Arson brings up Baldwin. Natalie, we're about to run out of time, correct?
That's right.
Can we go to the very final image in the seminar, the visual image?
Yes.
So, I showed you at the start the two sculptures. And I just wanted to end with this final image of kind of an empty plinth or an empty pedestal in Trafalgar Square. And just to return to this notion of thinking about space and be thinking about, again, just the simple act that writing as resistance is an instance of claiming space on the page, inscribing one's voice on the page. And Kahinda Wiley said a really interesting thing when he was talking about monuments of war and his revisioning of what a monument looks like. And also then in retrospect, in terms of all the political struggles around taking down Confederate monuments this year and rethinking what a monument is, what in terms of the public sphere. And he said he imagines kind of a culture where instead of having one monument that goes up on the spot where Confederate statues were, so let's take down a Confederate statue. And he says then instead of replacing it with one other monument, like, so for example, we should have artists of all styles come in for a period of time where their work is on the pedestal. Then it comes down and other voices go up there. I like that idea of the pedestal itself as the frame. And that got me really excited in terms of thinking about relating between visual art and literature, and this image of the empty plinth, the empty pedestal. Of course, in Trafalgar Square, This is kind of the fourth plinth. And so various sculptures come up there at different times, over the years. It's constantly replaced, whereas all the other plinths in Trafalgar Square have fixed sculptures, often commemorating, imperialist heroes. But then I just want to leave you with this idea that if we imagine the space of literature and the space of canon, the space of the literary canon in particular, as a kind of plinth or pedestal, and often, culture decides what writers get positioned up on that literary pedestal, in that kind of revered space of the canon. In terms of Elazam's notion that an art of resistance has no one specific style or formulation, I just want to leave you thinking with this idea that thinking of literature as that space of that empty plinth, where our goal as writers is to keep creating spaces for one writer after another to kind of occupy, to claim that space and to kind of inscribe their voice on the page within that space of literature, that sort of revered space of the canon. And to kind of keep, in a way, it's important to keep that space empty so that can keep shifting in terms of which voice ends up there. So we should finish up. I know there's a full schedule. Tracy, I'll put that Kehinde Wiley interview is in the New York Times. I'm just going to, if you just Google, I don't actually have access to the New York Times right now on this computer, but if you Google Kehinde Wiley, New York Times, you'll see the interview that came up with him around monuments of war. It'll come up easily. So thanks so much for sharing this time with me. Feel free to email me if you've got any follow-up questions. And thank you so much to Natalie and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for coming.